New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, Mind, Body, Spirit University, a leader in fully accredited in-person and online U.S. college degree programs in the topics we cover here. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
The interview you are about to hear contains subject matter about affective neuroscience. As a companion to our interview, we created a guide designed to help you unlock the power of your mind. Through tailored questions, discover how nurturing care, fear, anxiety, grief, and joyful play consciously and unconsciously motivate your everyday behavior. Download the guide at transformationandintegration.com/emotions, because your growth not only transforms your life, but evolves us all. Together, let's reshape our collective well-being.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hi, I'm Leanne Whitney, guest host working alongside host Jeffrey Mishlove, co-host Emmy Vadnais, and my other colleagues here at New Thinking Aloud. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Mark Solms to the show. Professor Mark Solms is Director of Neuropsychology at the Neuroscience Institute of the University of Cape Town. He is also Honorary Lecturer in Neurosurgery at the St. Bartholomew's and Royal London Hospital School of Medicine, as well as an Honorary Fellow of the American College of Psychiatrists. Mark is a member of the British Psychoanalytical Society and the American and South African Psychoanalytic Associations, and has received numerous awards and honors, including the Sigourney Prize. Mark has published 350 scientific papers and 8 books, with his latest being The Hidden Spring. Mark is the authorized editor and translator of the revised standard edition of the complete psychological works of Sigmund Freud and the forthcoming complete neuroscientific works of Sigmund Freud. Mark and I are fellow depth psychologists, Mark of a Freudian orientation, myself a Jungian orientation. So I deeply appreciate this opportunity to explore the intersection of our two approaches and the developments Mark has made in the field of neuropsychoanalysis. We discuss the 7 emotional primes of affective neuroscience, especially seeking and grief. We discuss human suffering and the long history of humans, including the Buddha and Patanjali, who have laid out paths of salvation, and the often hidden metaphysical assumptions behind all scientific endeavors. Mark is joining me today from his office in South Africa, and now I will switch over to the internet interview. Hi, Mark. Welcome, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
I always love to extend a hand across the aisle to Freudians. As a Jungian-oriented depth psychologist myself, that schism between Jung and Freud, I feel really crippled in many ways the discipline of depth psychology, and so I'm excited to have this conversation with you today. But your background is so interesting to who you've become or your whole field of research. So I'm wondering if you could tell us about that background, how you came to study neuropsychology, move into psychoanalysis, what that journey was like for you.
Yes, it began a very long time ago, not only because I'm getting old, but because I started very young. My engagement with the brain and the mind, I think, can be dated rather precisely to when I was just 4 and a bit years old. My older brother, who was 6, going on 7, he fell off the roof of a 3-story building onto his head, fractured his skull, sustained a hemorrhage in his brain, which is, life-threatening, or can be. And so he was flown. We lived in a small town. He was flown to the nearest city, which is Cape Town, which is where I live now. And bizarrely, actually, mentioning Cape Town being where I live now, I now work in the very same building as he was attended to, which was those days it was the Department of Neurosurgery. Now it's the Neuroscience Institute. My brother survived the accident. He came back home a few weeks, I suppose, later, and he looked the same. He apart from the fact that he had to wear a helmet to protect his fractured skull from harm, and although he looked the same, he was not the same. He wasn't the same person. I mean, he was literally a different guy, and so this confused and baffled me. You know, who is this person in my brother's body, and where is the original version of him now? Um, so, I mean, there was much else that happened. He lost his developmental milestones. He uh, struggled greatly at school, and so on. But I think that was the incident, without doubt. It was the incident that made me aware that we are somehow, that we, by we, I mean, yourself, your person, your being, is somehow also a bodily organ, in particular, the brain. And so that mystery, which has, of course, preoccupied many a mind over centuries, if not millennia, um, was forcibly brought front of mind for me at that point. And there are all kinds of things that flow from that in terms of pondering, if my brother is somehow this brain, uh, uh, and also this person, the same must apply to me. I too must somehow be a physical thing, as well as a sentient being. And how do these things relate to each other? And also, what becomes of me uh, if my brain is damaged? And what becomes of me if my brain dies, as it evidently will eventually? So these sorts of things were very much preoccupying me. But then, just to fast forward a little bit from there, because, as I told you, my brother struggled academically, um, and I did not. I was a bright little kid. Whenever I did well at school, and came home proudly, bearing my results, it was not a source of unequivocal joy in the household, because for every academic success that I achieved, there was a parallel pain, for a painful experience for my brother. And as I grew older, so I came to recognize that properly, and started to feel guilty about doing well. And then I say here, I think, because this part I don't remember consciously deliberating over. I think it was more of an unconscious solution to this conflict between ambition on the one hand and guilt on the other. I think that the solution I came to, as I say, without deliberating on it, was that if I do well in a field which helps people like my brother, then it's not so bad to do well. Um, and I think that's how I ended up becoming a neuropsychologist. But because of that peculiar personal motivation, I'm referring both to the metaphysical kind of concerns that had been sparked in me by my brother's accident and its sequelae, but also this need to help people like him. Uh, for those two reasons, I was rather quickly frustrated and disappointed by what I learned, because we're talking now about the early 1980s. is when I trained in neuropsychology. And there was no mention of metaphysical questions. If you asked your professors, but where does the self fit into all of this, and why? How does the brain come to actually be a person who experiences, the lived life of the mind? I was, almost literally told, "Don't ask questions like that." And I remember one professor saying to me, "It's bad for your career to be preoccupied with things like that." But also, it wasn't a therapeutic discipline. Um, the it varies from country to country what neuropsychology covers, but in my country at that time, it was a scientific discipline that had no we sort of supervised therapists and sent our patients to therapists, but no self-respecting neuropsychologist would actually do therapy. That was beneath them. And when I moved to London, which I later did, it was the same there. It was almost like a class difference. The scientists and their therapists, and the scientists are the upper level, and the therapists are doing sort of dog's body work. So for all of those reasons, because the sorts of things we were learning about was a purely mechanistic, third person kind of abstract, functionalist account of the mind, in which there was no lived life of the mind, no experiential being involved, and because it was so unconcerned with with helping people in distress. I decided then to literally um, jump ship. Not that I gave up neuropsychology. I moved to London, as I said, and I continued to work. I was at the Royal London Hospital in the Department of Neurosurgery by day, and by night I trained as a psychoanalyst at the British Psychoanalytical Society. It was a Jekyll and Hyde existence. So that's the background. My neuroscientific colleagues were absolutely horrified when I decided to train as an analyst. They said it's like an astronomer studying astrology. But I've never regretted it. I think it was the best decision I ever made in my life.
It's again a really personal journey that's brought you into the work that you've decided to hone in on, and maybe that's true for most of us, but certainly a big driver there. And what about psychoanalysis again? Freud, Jung being uh, the founders, if you will, of depth psychology. Um, Do you find that the work that you've been able to do in neuropsychoanalysis, and I think you actually coined that term, um, do you find that it has application across sort of uh, Jungian and Freudian contexts, or are you not familiar enough with Jung to be able to maybe even make that call?
No, I must be clear about my credentials. I have an amateurish knowledge of Jung. I don't have a complete ignorance, but I have what can only be called amateur knowledge. That doesn't mean that I am. I'm very opposed to this sort of sectarianism. I think it's very bad for our field. It's very bad for our patients. We're not football team supporters. We're trying to understand this part of nature and how it works, the part of nature that we ourselves occupy. And heaven knows we need all the help we can get. So I'm when confessing my ignorance, I'm not confessing or not professing a lack of interest or an antipathy. But yes, that's what I then went on to do. What I called, and which is now widely known as neuropsychoanalysis. By the way, it wasn't that I wanted a name for the field. It was that we started a journal in 1999, and we had to come up with a journal title. So that's how the word the neuropsychoanalysis was originally the title of a journal, and it then sort of rapidly caught on as the name for the whole interdisciplinary endeavor. But what I need to emphasize is, if you think about the story I just told you, um, that I wasn't trying to bring neuroscientific research methods to bear on depth psychology and psychoanalysis. It was very much the other way around. I was wanting to bring into neuroscience what we have learned in depth psychology about those aspects of the mind that they were so um, woefully neglecting in the neurosciences. So we have a whole we have a methodology, but we also derive from that methodology. We have a whole sophisticated conceptual armamentarium. We have terms and concepts. If all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. So if you have more tools in your toolkit, you can use them, and you can differentiate. So you start to see things um, in the mental life of the neurological patient and in the mental functions of the brain, that functions that just aren't considered, and phenomena that just aren't seen by neurologists and neuropsychologists. So that was my first intention. But once you build a bridge like that, of course, it can be traversed in both directions. So although that was what I was trying to do, was to bring something of the subjective aspect I mean, it is the most interesting thing about the brain, is that it feels like something to be a brain. There's nothing else in the known universe that has that property, that you actually have experience. And I um, thought that if we're leaving that out of our understanding of how the brain works, and leaving that observational perspective, what you can learn from the point of view of studying experience, we're never going to understand it. We're never going to understand how the brain works if we don't know that feelings actually matter, that they have causal power. They change what we do. And so if you think that all that it is an information processing device, you're not going to get very far. But once you've built that bridge, it works both ways, as I say. And so then I realized that actually we also have an opportunity on our hands, a major opportunity, to bring to bear on our theories on the other side of the fence, powerful methods and tools and concepts that are missing from depth psychology. And my scientific and clinical activities over the decades that followed were very much in both directions.
Yeah, beautiful. I love the bridge. First person, third person, conscious, unconscious. I mean, there's several bridges going on here, I think. And one of the places where there is the intersection for sure in Freudian and Jungian orientations is affect. I mean, really, that's sort of in many ways at the heart of the discipline, is this affective core of like a Jungian complex, but also the parasitic existences that Freud discovered way back in the day with Charcot and Genet and the people that he was researching with. Maybe before he even gave voice to the project of scientific psychology. But that kind of leads me to two things. First of all, I think definitions are important. And I think across disciplines, we do not have one agreed upon definition for consciousness or affect or emotion. I think you can go to a conference and, somebody comes in from child psychology, they're going to say one thing. Somebody comes in from neuroscience, they're going to say another. I particularly love the discipline of interpersonal neurobiology. And for Dan Siegel, the brain is really what's in the skull, but also the whole nervous system, all the way. So it's like the enteric brain, what's going on in the gut, what's going in the heart brain, as well as what's in the skull. Dan himself worked alongside a colleague named Jaak Panksepp, who I know was a major colleague of yours. And so I'd kind of like to just go in that direction right now, because Jaak perhaps actually coined the discipline of affective neuroscience. But affect is really the place where there's a great intersection with your work, my own work, but between the Jungian and Freudian bodies of work as well. So maybe walk us through how you discovered Jaak and then how you worked together to forward your body of work.
So just as much as neuropsychoanalysis was meant to be a corrective to the overly mechanistic focus of neuropsychology, nobody, when you use the word neuropsychology, you might as well say neurobehaviorism, or it's not, the word psyche is kind of a misnomer because there's no psyche there. So neuropsychoanalysis was a corrective to that. And affective neuroscience, Jaak's baby, was a corrective to the purely cognitive focus in cognitive neuroscience. So the word affective neuroscience was meant to be, in contradistinction to cognitive neuroscience. So clearly, we had something deeply in common. But before I tell you something more about that, I want to go back to what you said at the beginning of this question, when you said definitions are important, and then you spoke about the centrality of affect. I want to, because definitions are important, and as you say, different people mean different things by words like consciousness and affect, I want to be clear what I mean by the word affect. For me, as with Jaak, affect is broader than emotion. Emotions are things like fear and rage and lust and so on. But affect, the term affect covers also bodily affects like pain and hunger and sleepiness, and uh, the need to urinate even is an affect. So what is the defining feature of affect? Number one, it is valenced. In other words, there's a goodness and a badness to it. This doesn't apply to external objects. Perceptions of external objects are just perceptions. They're just representations of things. They're not in themselves good or bad. We bestow value on them by association with affects. So affects are unique in that they have intrinsic valence, value, good or bad value, to us, to the subject of those affects, and they involve arousal states, high or low levels of arousal. That's less important than the valence, and they have a peculiar quality in the sense that they are qualitatively distinguishable from each other. So hunger doesn't feel the same as thirst, doesn't feel the same as pain, doesn't feel the same as surprise, doesn't feel the same as too hotness, doesn't feel the same as, etc. So those three things, valence is the most important. Arousal is an intrinsic feature, and thirdly, the the categorical qualitative distinctions. These are the properties, and all of those things are subjective. An affect is experienced by a subject that only has value to and for the subject. It doesn't have value to the universe. Something is good for me. It might, something that I find thrilling, you might find terrifying. So it's very much a subjective thing. The arousal and the qualities and the valence of affect is all experienced, and it's that experience which is so lacking, as I was saying earlier, in this mechanistic third-person cognitivistic sort of approach. So I just wanted to get that out the way. Now, Jaak. I became aware of Jaak's. He wrote a chapter in the Bible of neurology. It's called the Handbook of Clinical Neurology. It's now in, gosh, I think there must be about 200 volumes of it. It's been coming out since the 60s, and as knowledge increases, so new volumes are added. And there was a volume in that series in which Jacques wrote a chapter in 1986, and it was the first thing that I read on affect by a neuroscientist that actually, well, first of all, they just didn't speak about affect. Remember, we're talking about the 80s when I trained. So this was 86, just after I qualified. And it was like, wow, here's a neuroscientist talking about affect and talking intelligently about it. And recognizing that this means experience, subjective, phenomenal, experiential being. It's like, wow, this is interesting. But it just was a flash in the pan. It was, that's interesting, but I didn't actually think of contacting the guy until his book came out in 1998. So a good 12 years later, this book, which has the title Affective Neuroscience, like Neuropsychoanalysis was the title of a journal, Affective Neuroscience was the title of a book. And this book was just breathtakingly brilliant. It was an absolute sort of an encyclopedic synthesis of everything that had been learnt in the 20th century about brain mechanisms of affect. Plus, with Jacques' unique sort of spin on it, where, as I said, he emphasized the fact that this is the core of mental being, and it is intrinsically subjective, and it's what makes us do anything at all. All of the cognition flows from the affective interest and the affective meaning and valence of things. And so that was when I thought I need to meet this guy. So I arranged for him and I to have an interdisciplinary dialogue in the very first issue of our journal, which came out in 1999. So he gave a neuroscientist's take on affect, I gave a psychoanalyst's take on affect, and then we had a interchange. And that was so satisfying that when we then had our first neuropsychoanalysis congress, which was in 2000, the next year, I invited him to be a keynote speaker, to be him and Antonio Damasio and Oliver Sacks. They were our keynote speakers at that conference. And that was the beginning of a lifelong collaboration with him. He became co-chair with me of the Neuropsychoanalysis Society that we founded at that first Congress. And we did lots of research together, wrote lots of papers together, and became very dear friends because he was just a great mensch, fantastic person. I mean, anybody who against the background of the behavioristic neurosciences that he came from, who realized, that this is what was needed in neuroscience, they can only be a very interesting and very good person. So we were dear friends until, he sadly died in 2017. So that's the story, really. He wasn't the only person, as I've mentioned, Oliver Sacks and Antonio Damasio, each in their own way. Oliver Sacks was much more of a clinical neurologist. Antonio Damasio, although he was fundamentally a neurologist, he was really a neuroscientist who, independently of Jacques, followed the same trajectory, realizing, hang on, there's something missing here. And so, I worked together with them too, but Jacques was the kingpin.
Didn't Damasio capitulate after reading Jacques' work? Like, it's two different books back to back there. Yeah, I think it was the influence of Jacques that helped Damasio.
Yeah, no, I want to say something about that because it doesn't often happen. Jacques wrote a review of, I think it's I'm trying to remember which of the two. There was Self Comes to Mind. That
There's the
came,
second one. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
The Feeling
Um,
Brain or something like that was the one before it. Something with feeling
yeah,
in the title, I think.
The Feeling of What Happens. It was called The Feeling of What Happens. So Jacques wrote a review of that book in our journal, actually. And Antonio was not pleased with this review because Jacques was saying this is too corticocentric, and it's the brain stem is where it's at, and you seem to think that affects are just perceptions of the state of the body. It's not just perception; it's something much more fundamental that drives the whole life of the mind. So this is the part that's unusual, is that Antonio, although he wasn't pleased, who's pleased to get a negative review of their book? Nevertheless, that made him immerse himself in Jacques' writing, and then he was persuaded that Jacques was right. And so then by the time Self Comes to Mind was published, which was really just the very next book, he had dropped his cortical focus, he had adopted a brainstem perspective, and he generously acknowledged Panksepp's priority in that respect.
Yeah. So the brainstem, again, it's bringing us deeper into the body. I want to make sure, I love the history. It's important. But I also want to give the viewers, some real material that sort of can help them in their own way. As you say, like as a collective, like we're all in this together. So, good mental health is of utmost importance. And, Jung would say, the psyche of the human, the psyche of man, was one of the greatest threats to our own existence. So it behooves us to understand psyche, brain, body, and of course have good mental health. So the valences that you're talking about, it's good, it's bad, it's coding. One way that I would frame it is, especially when you look at, and I'd love you to walk us through the 7 primes that Jacques came to, and that I know that you speak about in your book, Hidden Spring. Seeking, nurturing care, joyful play, for sure on the positive side, I want to say. And then we have panic, grief, distress. I think it's really important for anybody who is on the path of self-realization or self-reflection, self-inquiry, to really understand how these affects code for 2 completely different experiences almost. I'm not saying they aren't completely intermingled, and you can have being pulled in different directions. But again, when it goes to sort of health and sort of holistic healing, um, it is important to understand how these affects are guiding us and showing us the value of the inner experience, but also perhaps triggers or things that we meet in the external world as well. So yes, maybe starting with seeking, which I think is like, the number 1 sort of prime, and then if you could give us a robust look at these primes.
So let's start with what you said, quoting Jung or citing Jung. I think that the crucial thing is that we have all of these motivations, and we some of them are less constructive than others, and they conflict with each other. The human nature somehow has to incorporate within itself, and each of us as human persons has to deal with the fact that we have all of these inclinations. Um, then the next thing I want to say is that it sounds like a sort of a theoretical system. This is Jacques' system, so it's very important for our viewers to know this is the product of lots of research, in which he didn't start with preconceived notions. He was trying to identify, using mainly deep brain stimulation and then chemical probes. Once the circuits had been identified, it was clear what neuromodulators are mediated by those circuits. and then it was a matter of manipulating those brain chemicals and seeing what the consequences are for the affective life, not only of us human beings, but also of a great many different animal species that Jacques studied. So it's not just this is what I think. It's really, and that book of his summarizes all of that research and shows the very strong empirical basis for this taxonomy. And then another preliminary comment. Sorry, I'm probably saying more than you want to hear, but is that you must remember that these seven primes or basic emotions, as Jacques called them, they are just the emotional affects. There are many other affects. As I said earlier, they're bodily affects. They're also valenced, and they're also qualitatively differentiable from each other, and they also involve arousal states and so on. But there's seven that Jacques called emotional affects, and I won't start with seeking because it's actually quite a difficult concept. I'll start with ones that are easy. So they include fear. Everybody knows what fear is. It's bad to be in danger. If you are in danger, you feel fear. And you can see the biological basis of it, by the way, just from that. I mean, of course, an animal species, and we are whatever else we are a species of animal that didn't feel fear, wouldn't last very long. When confronted by danger, the motive to freeze or flee is that feeling. Then there's rage, which again, everybody knows what that is. If there's something frustrating, impeding, getting in your way, standing between you and what you want to get rid of that thing. And so that feeling of frustration, anger, rage triggers this behavior in the instinctual form, because a big part of the difficulty that Jung was referring to, we have these innate predispositions, but we can't just give free rein to them. The fact that you want to attack everything that gets in your way has to be tempered. You can't. What if it's your mother whose mother never frustrated them? You can't attack and destroy your mother. So there's that conflict aspect and the need to supplement from experience. This is what mental development is all about. Learning other ways of meeting these needs other than these crude, stereotyped, primitive reactions that we call instincts. So fear, rage, separation, distress, what Jacques called panic and grief. Again, very easy to understand that why we mammals, we can't look after ourselves. When we're born, we need to attach to somebody who looks after us. And if we become separated from that caregiver, then it feels bad in a separation distress sort of way. And if we don't just become separated, but actually lose our caregiver, then we fall into despair. And there are all sorts of reasons as to why and how that happens. So those are easy affects to understand. Care, people speak about attachment only in one direction. I want to be loved by my attachment object, but we also want to look after and nurture our little ones. And they don't have to only be our biological offspring, but that's obviously the biological origin of it all, that we care for our young, and we care by extension for vulnerable and dependent others. Then there's lust. Again, everyone knows what that is. Freud made, in Jung's opinion, too much of the sexual drive. And frankly, in my opinion, too, Freud thought every kind of pleasure it should be called sexual, and that certainly isn't borne out by Jacques' research. There are many different pleasures in the brain, one of which is lust. Then what I've left for last is the two most surprising ones. They are play. We mammals need to play. It's a biological urge. And all mammals play, all juvenile mammals play, rough and tumble play. In some form or another, you see it. You see it in squirrels, and you see it in dogs and cats and mice and rats. You see it in human kids, but you even see it, in whales and dolphins, and it's fantastic. And play seems to be all about the fact that we are a social species. We live in groups. We mammals, I mean, we all mammal species live in groups, and we have to learn to get on with each other. Because what's bad for the group is bad for the individual members of the group. So it's a way of establishing viable groups, which has a lot to do with hierarchies, with who's calling the shots and how fair are they being in the way that they're going about calling the shots. And so there's some very interesting things. Maybe we can talk about it more later. I'm not sure how much detail you want me to go into it, but it's learning about cooperation, reciprocity, mutuality. It's also learning in the safety of play, which isn't real, learning how to regulate your other basic emotional needs. So there's pretend fighting and pretend nurturance with dolls and so on. If you get it wrong, doesn't matter. It's just a doll. If you get it wrong in reality, whoops.
Right. I just want to say here too, like there are also sort of adjectives or adverbs used, like joyful play is the way that's
Yes.
written, and I think that word joy is also important for the context, right? Because like you're saying, it's about community.
Yeah. Yes. Joy, fun, friendship. These are very important motivators. And then the last one, which was the one you invited me to start with, is seeking. Seeking is a kind of it's kind of why we get up in the morning and do anything at all. It's an active, enthusiastic, to come back to your adjectives, enthusiastic, optimistic kind of engagement with the world, an exploration of the world, an exploration of what is not known. So it's a kind of exploratory urge, a kind of wanting to know. You could call it epistemophilic. It's like a love of knowledge, a love of understanding how things work, through a positive engagement with what is novel, and therefore by definition not known. It makes us curious, inquisitive, and so on. And it's also very invigorating. It's where it's as I say, why we do anything at all. It's an energizing, a thrusting of ourselves into the world to explore it. That's called seeking. And why you wanted me to start with it is because, of course, it is the most basic. The most basic thing is first we engage with the world because we find that we find it interesting, and because we expect our needs will be met there once we understand how the world works. But while you're busy exploring the world, suddenly a predator comes for you. So then, whoops, then you need fear, or somebody's competing with you, and you either learn how to cooperate with them through play, or you learn how to get rid of them through rage, and so on. So fear is the really, I mean, seeking is the real basic font, and all the others are arranged around the things that happen to you once you go out into the world.
Yes, and I really like actually how you're sort of and where you've ended up. Um, Novelty, exploration, not being bound in a small constricted world, that there is something inherently fulfilling to be in a body and to move out into the world and discover community and joyful play. Again, fear very warranted to keep negative influences or threats at bay. Um, but learning how to, and it's almost like an art, how to discover our inner world and work with relate to, have these affects inform our lived sense of being. So now I'm going to say something perhaps very idealistic, but so our world has a sense of harmony and perhaps less fractiousness, that the objectification of me versus you, us versus them, this tribalism that we often find ourselves in, the forever wars on this planet. Is it possible that there is a knowledge that we are able to discover in the system that allows us to really be able to see how these affects work together to guide humans towards a life where there's thriving for most, as opposed to, I think, what is often societies built upon a very dualistic, tribalistic, oppositional framework? Does that make sense?
No, it makes absolute sense. So I think that what you're talking about now is primarily, not exclusively, but primarily to do with play. It's not an idealistic notion that we can learn how to get along with each other, that we can learn how to be fair, that we can learn how not to be bullies, that we can empathize with what it's like to be the victim of being bullied or excluded. If nobody wants to play with you and nobody chooses you, and just these things, if our viewers will allow themselves to remember, we have sentimental views of play. Remember what it was like on the playing field when you were little. It was a serious business. Does anybody like me? Does anybody want to play with me? Do I have any friends? Am I a nerd? Or am I cool? All of that is about play. And I'm mentioning the unhappy side of play alongside the happy, joyful, camaraderie and rough and tumble and throwing your hat in the ring and see what happens and all of that, because of the next point I wanted to make, which is that although we all have a need to play, it doesn't mean we all actually do learn how to meet that need satisfactorily. So I won't mention any names of any politicians, but there are people who rise to power, but they're bullies, and their status is very precarious, because a viable group is not organized like that. It's organized like this, where there's something in it for everybody, and you learn to collaborate, cooperate, reciprocate, take account of, is this working for all of us? That's viable play. The most striking failure of play is war. What you mentioned. There's othering, but then there's war, which is like extreme othering. It's trying to, obliterate the other, and take what's theirs, for yourself. And so think about the difference between war, and there's enough of that going on in the world, and always has been, between that and the Olympic Games, which is play. Or football, there's a competition. It's fair. You all stick to the rules. It's fun. Nobody gets killed, except by the most, freakish of accidents. There are serious injuries, of course, in football, but it's not the intention to hurt anybody. The intention is to have good, clean fun. And you can have countries playing against each other, and it's us and them and all of that. But it's just, it's cooperative and collaborative. I don't want to idealize the United Nations, because heaven knows there's a lot wrong with the United Nations, but that's the sort of thing that comes out of successful play, or at least an attempt at successful play, rather than war. But then there's also the fact that it's not only play. You see, we have to remember that when you say perhaps you're being too idealistic, when we speak about the basic urges, these basic emotional driving forces of our species, they include not only nasty things, they include jolly good things, like play, nurture and care, seeking. I mean, what could be more interesting than wanting to know and understand the world? What could be more positive than that? And out of these things, seeking and play in particular, emerge not only sport but the arts. The whole of cultural life comes from play and from seeking. Philosophy, theology comes from seeking, as and science. Um, and music comes from play. The literature comes from play. Poetry or the film, all of it. So these are very positive things. Um, but alongside things like play and seeking and care and lust, which can be a little bit of a mixed bag, there's positive aspects of lust, but it depends how you go about doing it. There's some not so positive things too. But when then you get to the other side, to things like rage and fear and separation and loss. These are terrible things. We suffer them, and we need to find a way of reconciling, as I was saying a few minutes ago, all of these aspects of human nature with each other. And this is again why I think play is the bedrock of it, because play, although it is an emotional need all of its own, through play, as I said, we learn how to regulate our other emotions in the safety of play. So I think play is the kind of the glue that more than anything else pulls together and reconciles in a viable way all of these different inclinations we have.
I really love where you're going with this. Yes, I'm a Jungian-oriented depth psychologist, but I've studied yoga since 1998. So I'm a very long-term yoga practitioner, a non-dual yoga practitioner, even though there's a dualistic metaphysics inside of classical yoga. And there is a sutra, I believe it's 136, where Patanjali, who's the author of the Yoga Sutras, he speaks to the sorrowless luminous, this joyful, effulgent light, like this very luminous. And you brought up suffering, right? So yoga, like Buddhism, is a path of salvation, so to speak. There are psychologies inside philosophies that teach and guide human beings to move out of suffering and into liberation, if you will, self-realization. And a lot of it has to do with self-inquiry, which is learning how these affects flow in the body and the way they're valenced and how they're guiding us. You're pointing, I believe, just in the way that you're I don't want to railroad you there, but it is, and I can't help but pick it up through my own lens, right? That there is something in the understanding of affects, of moving from suffering into, whether you want to call it salvation or just a positively valenced way of being in the world, which has to do with joy and community and belonging. And this idea that seeking, that there's a freedom to continue to seek and create and play. I don't know if that resonates with you at all. I don't know actually what your spiritual background is.
Yes, it resonates with me very much, and you'll think as I answer your or respond to your last comment, you'll initially think, "Hang on, he hasn't understood what I was saying." So just bear with me. I'm going to start by responding biologically, and then I'll move on to onto the more spiritual terrain. Biologically, I need to introduce a concept. Probably the most basic mechanism in all biology is homeostasis. In homeostasis, there's a viable state for each species where you need to be. So, like your core body temperature, you got to be in this range. If you're out of that range, it's horrible. You're feeling too cold or you feel too hot. and beyond those feelings, eventually you die. If you get too hot or too cold, there's only so much that's what we call our viable range. And so there's a set point or a settling point, it's the ideal state, and then there's this viable range and then there's death beyond that. And I spoke of body temperature, but the same applies to all of our needs, including the emotional needs I spoke of earlier, and obviously our bodily needs. So temperature, blood pressure, blood sugar, blood oxygen, etc., etc. But likewise, the ideal point for fear is I'm not in danger. The ideal point for rage, that drive, is there's no frustrating, impeding objects getting in my way. So that's homeostasis. So that's the biological thing. Now, I'll say something Freudian, which again will make you think I didn't understand you. For Freud originally thought that we're seeking pleasure, that all we're seeking is pleasure. So he had this thing called the pleasure-unpleasure series, and he thought we're just trying to go that way as much as we can. And then eventually he realized he was mistaken. That there's something, to quote this famous paper of his, beyond the pleasure principle. There's something deeper that we're striving for. And that led him to introduce a second principle, which he called the nirvana principle. Now you see I'm heading towards what you're talking about. So Freud thought that these are two separate principles, that on the one hand, we're looking for pleasure, and then that's the expression of the pleasure principle. And on the other hand, beyond that is another drive, and he thought it was driven by a death drive of all the most idiotic ideas. Nirvana isn't death. Nirvana is no need, no suffering. So if you can link those two ideas, the Freudian one with the biological one, you see in homeostasis, nirvana is the settling point. It's the ideal state. And unpleasure is a movement away from the ideal state. Pleasure is a movement back, but you don't carry on getting more and more pleasure. Eventually you've had enough. That's satiation. That's when you're back where you need to be. So, even with eating chocolate, eventually you've had enough. Even with sex, eventually it's okay, it's enough already. That's satiation. So that's how homeostasis works. Now, what you're talking about, yoga, all the meditative practices, and the whole of the Buddhist philosophy or religion, whatever you want to call it, the Buddhist way. These are ways in which our the people upon whose shoulders we stand, our predecessors in humanity, for literally, millennia. These practices developed as ways of getting to nirvana, ways of transcending suffering, ways of not being in any kind of distressed state. So it was. We've just discovered the same thing. When Freud found nirvana principle, he didn't understand it in the same way. When biologists speak about homeostasis, it's the same thing. So it's just a different language, a different set of tools you used for getting to these absolutely fundamental truths. But what I need to emphasize is that you don't get there easily. Nirvana is not a natural state. It's the natural state is suffering, and so it requires a great deal of effort, spiritual, mental effort to reach that sort of understanding, and to master those sorts of techniques. And I use the word advisedly. It's techniques. These are things we've learned to be able to transcend what we otherwise naturally would do in order to acquire these. They are acquired abilities of how to get to that ideal state that in biology they call homeostasis, and that in Buddhism it's enlightenment and nirvana.
Oh, amazing. You couldn't have summed that up better because yeah, as I was preparing for this interview, and always, again, I have quoted your work, I've utilized it in papers and a book that I wrote. I'm like, gosh, they're right on top of this, really. Because for me, it is a young yoga, an East West, because they're in the literature. We're just going about it different ways, different tools, using neuroscience, affective neuroscience. But I 100% agree with you, and I know you're drawing from your also collaboration with Carl Friston there. This idea of the homeostasis, and I'll mention, you said satiation in the yoga. It's contentment, santosha. It's a big part of the yogic path. Um, and this also does get to perhaps ideas of metaphysics. We haven't talked about a definition of consciousness. I think Jung would be very sympathetic to your work. In a 1938 paper, he said emotion is the chief source of consciousness. As a non-dualist, now my metaphysics are a little bit different, because consciousness for me is actually all there is, and knowledge is structured in it. I have so many things that are threaded in here for me. It's like, yeah, sure, there is suffering there. But as we build this knowledge in the academy for what it is in the West, because again, it's thousands, millennia, thousands of years for yogis and Buddhists. Is it possible that we can create a framework where human beings have a better chance of thriving, and maybe at this point even surviving, depending upon what it is that we do to our environment? Because there's no smart species that toxifies its water supply. There's no smart species that doesn't build a habitat that's sustainable or live like nature is given. And this is the rock that we're standing on, and the air that we breathe, and the trees and the mycelium, and that intelligence that informs the interdependence and the interconnectivity of everything that allows us to even be present on this planet. Do you ever see a time where we put it together in the field of consciousness studies, that we're able to create a framework that allows the human being to ground into their body in a beautiful way and create community where there is, and I'm sure this is happening in places, it's just in Euro-American culture in particular, there's been a lot of grist for a long time. I've said a lot there.
So you're asking, can we build a framework? And I would say not only that we can, I will say that we have, and we've done it time and again. The profound insights that were arrived at by people like the Buddha are, as I've said a few minutes ago, the same insights framed in a different way, using different tools, but they're the same insights as, for example, you mentioned now Carl Friston. Carl Friston is at the cutting edge of computational neuroscience. Everything that he does is built upon the biology of homeostasis fundamentally. It's the same. So therefore, it's the same sort of the contentment and the enlightenment and the nirvana that we were speaking of earlier. Different words for this thing that we keep on rediscovering, that this is what we need. This is what, why don't we go there, and how do we go there? So the Buddha gave us a whole lot of insight into how you can do it. And we nowadays, when there's such a much more materialistic kind of zeitgeist, a kind of mindset, especially in the West. If you can frame the same thing in neuroscientific terms, people like Jung tried to frame them in psychological terms. In the 20th century. So it's giving people, showing them the way. But remember what I said earlier. It's not the natural state. I think you have to be shown the way, and then you have to take that path, and or not, and not everybody will take it. So I think a very good analogy to use to make the point I'm trying to articulate here is that those of us who parents, we see our children, making mistakes. We know we were children too. We were teenagers too. We made those mistakes, and we think that we can just tell them, no, don't do it that way. I've learned. I'm older than you. Down. That's the wrong path. Take this path. Well, they might listen to you, they might not. Each generation has to learn these lessons for themselves, because they don't come easily. Some will do it, and some won't do it, and some will get it wrong. And so I don't think that we're incapable of developing frameworks. As I say, I think we have developed frameworks. It's that I don't think there's any easy way to get to the outcome that you're talking about. And I'm sorry if I sound like a curmudgeonly old, cynic. I don't feel like that. I mean, I'm as optimistic as you can be in the world that we find ourselves in. I'm a kind of can-do person, and I don't give up readily at all. But I don't think that it's just a matter of developing a framework. I think that it's a matter of the task of persuading people to draw upon that framework, and not all people will do it. And I think that this is also why there's such an important place still in our times for depth psychology, and for the deep work that we do with our patients. It's you can't just tell people the truth and then they believe it. You can't just show them the way and then they follow it. It's a struggle. And the internal forces that we are up against. Remember what I've said more than once in our conversation about conflict, that there are different inclinations, and we have to find a way of reconciling them with each other, and that takes effort. So I hope I'm making the point clearly that I'm trying to make.
I think so. And attention is what comes to mind. It's also where people are going to focus their attention. I mean, that's part of awareness or consciousness. And I am definitely mindful of time here. So perhaps we can end actually in the field of consciousness studies overall. I know you're very flexible and open to, what consciousness is. But perhaps you could just share with our viewers, for you, affect is the font or the arising of consciousness. That is correct, right? I mean, that's still your position today.
I think that affect, in other words, feeling, is the elementary form of consciousness. And it is prerequisite for all the other forms. It is the kind of primordial form of consciousness upon which all the others are contingent, you can't have. I mean, certainly consciousness consists in more than just feeling, but you can't have those higher forms of consciousness unless they are grounded in feeling, and that's again not a philosophical statement, but rather a scientific one. In other words, it's empirically demonstrably so. The part of the brain that generates affect, which is the upper brain stem, within the upper brain stem, there's a set of structures called the reticular activating system. If you damage those structures, to the extent of just the tiniest area. In fact, the smallest area that reliably, predictably, in other words, routinely produces coma. The smallest area of damage is in a part of the reticular activating system called the parabrachial complex, and the area of damage is the size of a match head, 2 cubic millimeters. It's tiny, tiny, tiny. So that shows you that the whole house of cards of consciousness collapses if you take away that foundation stone, which is provided by brainstem arousal, which is fundamentally affective. The higher forms of cognitive consciousness, which are fundamentally cortical, um, you can remove the whole cortex, as has been, I'm afraid to say, been done in many animal species in experiments. The animal doesn't go into a coma. They remain emotional beings. And the same applies to human beings who are born without any cortex. It's a condition. It's not common, but it's not particularly rare either. Children born with no cortex, they're not comatose. They are conscious, feeling beings who show all the emotions we spoke of earlier. They show all of them, but they are incapable of cognitive consciousness because they haven't got cortex. They're blind. They're deaf. They cannot have conscious perceptions or any cognitions derived from conscious perceptions. They just have feelings. They don't know what the feelings are about, but they have them and they show them. They respond, with feeling. If you tickle them, even though they don't have a conscious sensation of the affective touch, it evokes a feeling in them. The unconscious information goes into the brainstem. The information from the skin and the eyes and the ears and so on goes unconsciously into the brainstem, and then the child responds accordingly, with pleasure, with rage, with fear, with surprise, exactly what you would expect given the emotional stimulus. So this is why I'm saying, affect is the fundamental form of consciousness. It's not just a speculation.
Well, just as a final word, Mark, if you have any around where you would like to see the field of consciousness studies go, or even the field of depth psychology, or both.
Where would I like to see consciousness studies go, and affective neuroscience and depth psychology? Well, first of all, I thank heavens that we have such a thing as consciousness studies, because when I was a student, which wasn't, centuries ago, it was decades ago. As I'd said at the very beginning of our very interesting conversation, I qualified in 1985. There was nothing in neuroscience called consciousness studies. And there was no such thing as neuroscientists and philosophers, let alone people outside of the Western canon, communicating with each other about these things. So we're living through, I think, a golden age in neuroscience, not because of all of the great reductionistic discoveries, but because of the opening up of the big questions. So the fact that there is such a thing as consciousness studies, which is being participated in by a great many disciplines, not only neuroscience, but that it is in neuroscience too, and it's not a fringe topic. It's not marginalized. It's the fact that we give it pride of place, the central position that always should have had, is great. The fact that we have such a thing as affective neuroscience is exactly the same thing. The role of depth psychology is, I think, where I'd like to see it go is what I've been trying to do over the last whatever it is now, 40 years, which is to try to bring us together. And I don't only mean the different traditions within depth psychology. I mean even more so, the depth psychologies and the neurosciences. That they should be working together. This is what neuropsychoanalysis is all about. Whatever they call it in the future, I would be very happy if there's no need for a word for it, that it just naturally, people who study the depths of the mind also know what you can learn about it from the neuroscientific point of view, and vice versa. That people who study the profound mysteries of the brain, that they also bring to bear on it everything that can be learnt about it from the point of view of the subjective experiential methodologies that we use in the depth psychology. So these are not fantasies, because they're happening. They actually, I think we actually are living through a period where these things that I dreamt of in the 1980s are now happening in the 2020s. Doesn't mean that there's not still a long way to go, but I told you I'm not a cynic. I'm very optimistic. I'm very optimistic about where we're going in all of those respects.
Well, I deeply appreciate your optimism, your curiosity, your openness, your body of work. And I thank you so much for coming and sharing all of your wisdom and your insight and your research. I deeply appreciate it. So thank you for being with me.
Thank you. Thanks for a fascinating and very enjoyable conversation.
Thank you. And thank you for those of you watching and listening. Thank you for being with us. You are the reason that we're here in community, exploring our common unity.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue 7 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine, or order a beautiful printed copy.
Book 3 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You are warmly invited to visit transformationandintegration.com to access additional resources that support the journey through deep transformation, and to learn more about the ongoing offerings at Center for Transformation and Integration, including our certified training in transformational coaching with an emphasis in somatic integration therapy. I look forward to welcoming you there.